Before I got my table saw, for some reason I conceived it in my mind's eye as being about 20% smaller than it really was. I thought I'd be able to use it on top of the benches in my workshop and stow it beneath them, but when it arrived it was pretty quickly apparent that that wasn't going to work. I wanted to start using the saw though, so I stacked it on a few heavy-duty plastic boxes, and that allowed me to get going. This was obviously not a long-term solution though, so I began thinking about building a new bench unit for the saw. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted this potential bench to do. I began sketching some ideas out, and eventually my ideas fit into three main design goals. The first was to replace my workmate bench, the second was to make a stable, manoeuvrable base for the saw, and the third was to combine some dust collection into the unit. And I wanted to do this entirely out of scrapwood I already had in the workshop. The thing that used to float in the middle of my workshop was this workbench. It was very useful in theory, but there was lots I didn't like about it in practice. It was never any good at gripping anything between its jaws, which was a bad place to start. It was also the wrong height to use as a trestle alongside the other benches that were already in my workshop. And the thing that annoyed me most about it is that although it folded, it never folded very flat, so it could never really be stowed effectively. I started work on its replacement with the little bench tops. I had a load of scrap ash that used to be the shelves in my office in my old apartment, so I used that to edge some nice and flat MDF. While the bench tops were being glued up, I did a lot of vague searching and clicking around on the internet to try and find what to drive the vise with, and I ended up ordering these lead screws, which I think were meant for some kind of CNC machine. I glued up, then cut up some scraps of sapele from the front door project to give somewhere for the mechanism to go, then began drilling the holes for the threaded rods and the bearings they came with. This went pretty badly, with the auger bit splitting out the timber, but it was enough to prove that the concept would work and that I had successfully built myself a little workbench vise. I decided that while I wasn't proud enough to rebuild these pieces at this point, I was proud enough to put some filler in them, and even to daub a little paint over them to make the filler less noticeable. I also popped some anti-friction tape onto the horizontal surface the back half of the vise slid along, but I'm not sure how much difference it made. But with the vise at least semi-built, that gave me some more dimensions to work with on the rest of the bench. One of the first decisions I made about the saw base was to put it on some casters. I had learned from the door project that it was really useful to be able to move the saw if I was cutting longer material, so casters seemed like a safer way of doing so. The size of the mounts for the wheels dictated the size that the leg stock needed to be, so what caught my eye in the scrapwood library was the rotting, possibly oak beam that I rescued from my porch. I wasn't sure if it was a sin to cut up such a huge piece of wood, but it was all really split from decades of being out the front of my house, so it was never going to be a showpiece. I decided this was as good a place as any though, to give this piece of timber a new lease of life, so I began using a power plane to straighten one surface up, and quickly learned that it isn't as easy as Leo the boat builder makes it look. I got it acceptable though, and after reserving some of it for another project I have in mind, I used the table saw to mill this up into some nice chunky stock for the legs. And was relieved to see I had saved just enough to avoid the extent of the rot in the bottom of the beam. Splits aside, I gave the legs a good sanding to get rid of all of my shonky saw marks. I managed to get the first horizontal beams out of the possibly oak and sanded them up too, then began cutting mortises and tenons to attach them together. don't know what I was thinking in doing this, but for some reason I thought it would be a good idea to mount the flat surface the saw would be sitting on by cutting a rebate into the frame. It wasn't a good decision, as it meant a load of chiselling at a part of the wood that was already weak from earlier bad design decisions. The second leg went slightly better, and I was committed to the flush mount at this point, so I found another scrap of MDF and gave it all a dry fit. The fit wasn't very good, but I decided I'd wait until it was all glued up before trying to address it any further. I didn't have any more possibly oak for the lower horizontal rails, so I had a dig around in another nightmarish scrap pile and found some more leftover sapele from the door. I milled some beams up as efficiently as I could manage, then double-checked how tall Helena was, as the height of the vacuum dictated where these rails would go into the legs. I cut a couple more mortises and tenons for these rails. Then, because I thought MDF would be too floppy for the job, I grabbed a scrap of plywood to cut the Helena hatch out of. It took me a moment to figure out how to cut the slot without a jigsaw after I killed it in my last video, but I ended up doing it very effectively by putting the router on a pivot, which I failed to record, then used the table saw to cut the slot out. After another dry fit of everything I'd made, it was looking pretty good, but I noticed that one of the legs was sitting really twisted. I guess my milling of the timber was wonkier than I thought, and the problem compounded when I cut the mortises. So I went back and cut them more, which made the tenons go in straighter, but they were now really loose. I decided the answer was to load up the mortises with a load of filler and give them a good clamping while the filler dried. And that worked about as well as I could have hoped. It kind of forced me into getting these side parts glued up. With the glue dry, I did another test assembly, and it was beginning to feel pretty solid in 2 axes, but it needed stiffening up in the 3rd dimension. I cut some strangely but carefully shaped pieces of more leftover sapele, then wedged a piece of MDF into the grooves I cut, which did the job nicely. I started screwing it all together and nailing in the lower shelf, which got it strong enough to have another go at levelling the top rebate. The rebate was still a bad idea, but after doing more damage to the legs with the router, I eventually got the MDF to fit acceptably, and moved on to assembling the supports for the vice section. It was finally all nice and rigid in all directions, so I thought it was time to install the caster wheels, until I realised they didn't come with any fixing hardware. I popped to my local hardware store and got a nice paper bag of nuts and bolts and got the wheels attached. Well, I guess this is the moment of truth, when I find out if I've made it the wrong height. Once they were on, it was a relief to see the height of the bench was correct, and it was all looking pretty good. The next job was to secure the saw to the bench. The saw came with mounting holes, so I measured them up and added some bolts to the bench for the saw to drop onto. And then I secured it down with some wing nuts, which will make it easier if I ever need to detach the saw from the bench. The whole thing was looking good and ready to function now, but there was still much more to do. Next was to add a pair of rails to stow my cross-cutting sled under the saw. I thought for a moment about trimming the slides on the bottom of the sled for an easier life on the rails, but I decided cutting some notches out of the rails was a better idea, because it would discourage the sled from falling out. The circular slot I cut for Helena was a good fit, but because the vacuum had wheels of its own, I ended up cutting out these strangely sculptural little notches to allow it to bump into the slot and hold in there, which worked pretty well. I also took this time to tidy up the power cords, attaching a socket for both the saw and the vacuum to run off one cord. I made a couple of toggles for the cord to wrap around when the bench was not in use, which went pretty well and were a great use of these ever smaller scraps of hardwood. I decided that, like the vice fixtures, I wasn't too proud to put filler in the spots where I messed up the top of the legs, and I was also vain enough to touch it up with a bit of paint. The stove for the cross-cutting sled left a nice space for a drawer, so I got some cheap slides that were wrapped in a package featuring this nice young lady. I puzzled for a minute about how to attach the drawers, and the best answer I came up with was to hang the slides from the underside of the bench top, which went alright with the help of a few pilot holes. I then used some more scrap plywood to make a quick drawer box. And the drawer slides ended up going in with no fuss. I didn't mean to get slides with a push latch. It's a little finicky, but at least it means there doesn't need to be any kind of handle on the drawer front. The drawer makes for a nice space to store some of the saw and vacuum accessories that have otherwise been floating around the workshop without home. Back at the workbench end, I decided I couldn't avoid screwing the vice parts together anymore. So I did. I then set to work making some handles. I tried to over-engineer these with some of the leftover bearings from the vice mechanism, which I don't think worked very well in the end, but I'm happy to have tried. I made the handles out of some leftover ash dowel. Then did some questionable sanding to round over the edges. I later decided they were too long, so I cut them down and it betrayed how wonky my centre holes were. Oh no. I think I could do just about everything about this vice better with a second attempt. Oh no. But at least it works for now. Hell on a bottom carpet never really had anywhere tidy to stow away in the workshop, so it was already a win that I made somewhere for it to be stowed in this bench. Several people left comments on my last video though, suggesting that I got a cyclone to improve my dust collection situation. I was really dubious about the idea of a cyclone, so I found the cheapest one I could, which of course shipped from China. Considering the bench was sized to fit the saw and the casters and the cross-cutting sled, it was also the perfect size to fit one of the plastic crates I use elsewhere in the workshop. I had a broken lid already, so I decided I'd try cutting a hole for the cyclone into that first. I was disappointed with the results. It turns out I could have done with watching a few more YouTube videos before embarking on this part of the project, as the likes of Rag and Bone Brown and Badger Workshop had already tried these exact footsteps before me, working out that the collection box needed to be airtight for it to work. I wasn't sure if I was throwing good money after bad by pursuing this cyclone project with my tiny little vacuum cleaner to power it, but the solution I came up with was to fill the perimeter of the lid with some silicone to create a sill. I left the silicone to dry for a day and tried it again, which looked more promising until the aforementioned crack blew through. Because the silicone hadn't really set, I scooped most of it out into a new lid and started again. Then I left it to dry for a lot longer. While I was waiting for it to cure, I got a bit carried away with a pointless creative errand. A friend suggested that as the cyclone was vase-shaped and it came from China, I should paint it like a priceless vase, so I did that. After a bit of googling, I decided its shape was best suited to the Song dynasty, so I took my inspiration from there and this daily post-it note from a few months ago featuring Frisbee as a dragon. I was reminded that I have ruined all of my fine-tip brushes again. But it came together really quickly, and it was well worth the effort by how it looked in the end. I attached a couple of brackets to the bottom of the bench, but the whole box and cyclone setup was just a bit too tall to fit under there, so I had to rethink it and I ended up attaching the lid and cyclone to the bench, creating a setup in which the dust box can drop out when it needs emptying. There are still lots more details to be worked out through use, but I think it's about time to call this project done for now. I'm really pleased with it. I've ended up hitting about 9 different design goals with this, and I think it looks pretty smart too. It might have looked better if it was all the same kind of timber, but the fact that I made this almost entirely from hardwood, that it was all entirely from scraps, is really rewarding. It doesn't really look like I've put a dent in the scrapwood library, but progress is progress. I think when I find a bit of motivation, I will give manufacturing the vice mechanism a second go, as I can see several improvements I can make on that already, and I've barely used it yet. I can also see adding a more convenient switch to the vacuum for a future improvement too. But it's about time I stopped making stuff for my tools and instead used my tools to make some stuff. This is definitely acceptable woodworking though. I'm even further from fine woodworking than my front door was, but it still turned out really nicely, and it should be a great asset to my workshop. Thanks for watching this video.